Have you ever felt like your prayers are just empty words floating into nothingness? Have you cried out to God with everything inside you, begging for a sign, a miracle, an answer, only to be met with silence? How many nights have you laid awake, wondering if He even hears you? Wondering if maybe, just maybe, you're praying wrong, or worse, maybe He's ignoring you. And what if I told you that this silence, the same silence that has made you question everything, might actually be proof that something much greater is happening in the unseen? Most people don't realize this, but some of the most powerful moves of God happen in complete silence. And yet, this is where many lose their faith. They mistake His silence for absence. They assume their unanswered prayers mean rejection. They don't know the truth, that when heaven seems quiet, the battle in the spiritual realm is at its peak. The enemy wants to break you in this moment. He whispers in your ear, telling you that God has forgotten you, that your prayers are useless, that there's no point in believing anymore. But those are lies. And right now, at this very moment, you were led to this video for a reason. This is not an accident. This is not a coincidence. This is your divine appointment. The fact that you are here means God is working, even if you don't see it yet. And I need you to understand something. There is a secret hidden in Scripture that explains why your prayers feel unanswered. There is a spiritual principle that few truly understand, and that principle is the key that separates those who see miracles from those who give up too soon. If you leave now, you may never uncover what God wanted to show you today. So before we go any further, I want you to take a step of faith. If you have ever felt ignored by God, if you have ever cried out in frustration, waiting for an answer that never came, I want you to declare something powerful in the comments right now. Type, "Lord, I refuse to give up on you." This is not just a comment, this is a prophetic act. When you declare it, you are standing against the spirit of doubt that has been trying to take hold of your heart. You are choosing faith over fear, trust over confusion. And if you're serious about your spiritual growth, if you're tired of feeling lost and want to go deeper in your faith, then subscribe to this channel right now. Too many people treat their relationship with God casually, and that's why they never experience His power. But those who seek, find. Those who press in, those who refuse to quit, those are the ones who see breakthroughs. If you are ready for more, if you are ready to unlock the truth about unanswered prayers, then stay with me until the very end. Because today, you may receive the answer that changes everything. Let's begin. Imagine a child who begs his father for the keys to the car. The child is sincere, desperate even. He truly believes he is ready to drive. But the father, with a wisdom the child does not yet possess, refuses. Not because he wants to deny his child, not because he doesn't love him, but because he knows the dangers of granting something before the right time. If the father gave in to the child's cries, it would not be love, it would be neglect. The child sees denial, the father sees protection. The child sees rejection, the father sees preparation. Now think about how many times we cry out to God, asking for something we believe we are ready for, something we desperately desire. We ask for healing, for financial breakthroughs, for relationships to be restored, for doors to open. And when the answer doesn't come, we assume the worst. Why is God ignoring me? Why is He letting me suffer? Why won't He just give me what I'm asking for? But could it be that what feels like denial is actually divine protection? Could it be that the thing you want so badly is something God, in His infinite wisdom, knows is not yet safe for you to have? Think about Moses. He was called by God to deliver the Israelites, but his first attempt ended in disaster. He saw an Egyptian mistreating a Hebrew, and, in a rush of anger, took matters into his own hands, killing the Egyptian. He thought he was stepping into his calling, but instead he had to flee for his life. For the next 40 years, Moses lived in the wilderness. Imagine how often he must have questioned himself, how many times he must have wondered, did I ruin God's plan? Has he forgotten me? But in reality, God was not ignoring him, he was preparing him. Because when Moses finally stepped into his destiny, it wasn't as an impulsive young man acting on emotion, but as a leader who had been refined through time, hardship, and humility. The delay wasn't punishment, it was training. The same is true for you. Some prayers aren't answered yet because you're not ready for what you're asking for. Think about this. What happens if you bake a cake and pull it out of the oven too soon? It collapses. It's raw in the middle, unable to fulfill the purpose for which it was created. Some blessings work the same way. If God gave them to you too soon, they would not sustain you, they would break you. That job you've been praying for, that relationship you're begging Him to restore, that financial blessing you're desperate for, if you are not fully prepared for it, it could crumble under pressure. And here's what you need to realize. God is not just preparing the blessing for you, He is preparing you for the blessing. Look at David. He was anointed as king when he was just a shepherd boy, but he didn't step into the throne immediately. Instead, he spent years in the wilderness, running for his life, being chased by Saul, living in caves, enduring betrayal. It would have been easy for David to question God's silence. Lord, you promised I would be king, so why am I suffering? Why am I running instead of ruling? But what David didn't realize at the time was that every battle, every hardship, every silent night was shaping him into the man who could handle the weight of the crown. God was not denying him the throne. He was preparing him to carry it. So I ask you, what if the delay in your life is not rejection, but refinement? What if the prayers that feel unanswered are actually being answered in a way you don't yet recognize? Think about when you plant a seed. You water it, you nurture it, and for weeks, maybe even months, you see nothing. But just because you don't see movement on the surface doesn't mean that growth isn't happening underground. Some prayers work the same way. God is growing something in you, something that takes time, something that can't be rushed. He sees the full picture, while you only see a small piece. What you think is delay is actually divine development. Think about Noah. God told him to build an ark, but then nothing happened for years. Imagine what that must have felt like. Building, preparing, waiting, enduring ridicule. People must have laughed at him, mocked him, told him he was wasting his time. But Noah remained faithful. And then, when the storm finally came, he was ready. He didn't have to scramble to build the ark in the middle of the flood. He had already done the work. Could it be that God is calling you to build in the silence? To keep praying, keep preparing, even when you see no immediate results? Because here's the truth. Faith is not proven in the moments when prayers are answered instantly. Faith is proven in the moments when heaven is silent. What do you do when you pray and nothing changes? What do you do when you fast and seek and knock and the door still doesn't open? Do you give up or do you keep believing? Some of you are on the verge of quitting. You've prayed, you've cried, and you're tired. But listen to me. This is not the time to stop. This is the time to press in. The enemy knows how close you are, and that's why the attacks have been relentless. That's why you feel weary. That's why doubt is creeping in. Because you are standing on the edge of something greater than you can imagine, and the only way to miss it is to walk away too soon. So I challenge you, fight for your faith. Stand on God's promises even when it doesn't make sense, even when you don't hear His voice, even when you don't see results. Because those who hold on, those who keep believing, those who refuse to quit, those are the ones who see the fulfillment of His promises. And if you receive this word today, I want you to declare it in the comments. I will not give up. I trust God's plan. Speak it, write it, believe it. Let it be your declaration, because your waiting is not in vain. Your prayers are not unheard, and the silence you are experiencing right now is not the end of the story. It is the setup for something far greater than you can imagine. Stay with me, because in the next part of this message we are going even deeper. There is something about unanswered prayers that most people never realize, and it may just be the key to unlocking everything you've been waiting for. Some prayers go unanswered, not because God is silent, but because He is waiting for you to shift your posture. Many people assume that prayer is just about asking, but in reality, prayer is a two-way conversation. It's not just about speaking, it's about listening. And sometimes, the reason you're not hearing from God is because you're too busy talking, too busy demanding, too busy expecting an answer in the way you think it should come. Think about Elijah. He was a prophet who had seen God move in powerful ways, fire from heaven, miraculous provisions, supernatural victories. But after facing opposition, he found himself in a cave, hiding, exhausted, feeling abandoned. He needed to hear from God. He needed an answer, and then something incredible happened. There was a mighty wind so powerful that it tore through the mountains. But God was not in the wind. Then came an earthquake, shaking the very ground beneath him. But God was not in the earthquake. Then came a fire, fierce and consuming, but God was not in the fire. And then, after all the noise had passed, after all the chaos had stilled, there was a whisper. And that whisper was the voice of God. How many times have you expected God to answer you in an earthquake, in a dramatic sign, in a miracle that shakes the heavens, only to miss His voice because you weren't listening for the whisper? Could it be that He has been speaking all along, but you have been so focused on the storm that you missed His still, small voice? God does not always respond the way we want Him to. He is not a vending machine where you put in a prayer and immediately receive an answer. He is a father, and a good father knows that sometimes the best thing for his child is not a quick answer, but a process that draws them closer to Him. Imagine a young child learning to walk. The father stands a few steps away, arms open, calling the child forward. But what if, the moment the child stumbled, the father immediately picked them up and carried them everywhere? The child would never learn. The child would never grow. The Father's love is not proven in preventing the fall. It is proven in allowing the process, in encouraging the child to keep trying, to keep reaching, to develop strength. Some of your unanswered prayers are because God is teaching you how to walk in faith. Think about how Jesus performed miracles. Some people were healed instantly, but others were asked to take a step of faith first. When the 10 lepers came to Jesus asking for healing, He didn't touch them, He didn't speak over them. He told them to go show themselves to the priest. And as they went, they were healed. Not before, not immediately. As they walked. Luke 17:14. What does this mean? It means that some prayers are answered in the process, not in the moment. Some breakthroughs happen as you walk in obedience, as you step forward in faith even when you don't see results yet. Could it be that the reason you haven't received an answer is because God is waiting for you to take the first step? So many people say, God, open the door and then I'll walk through it. But sometimes God is waiting for you to walk, and the door will open as you move. Look at Peter. When he saw Jesus walking on the water, he asked, Lord, if it's you, tell me to come. And Jesus said one word, come. Matthew 14:29. Peter could have waited for Jesus to calm the waves first. He could have hesitated, waiting for a more detailed explanation, a clearer sign. But he didn't. He stepped out of the boat. And in that moment, something supernatural happened. He walked on water. Some of you are waiting for your miracle, but your miracle is waiting for you to step out in faith. What if Peter had never left the boat? What if the lepers had refused to walk? What if Abraham had never left his homeland? What if Noah had waited for the first raindrop before building the ark? Some prayers require action. Some prayers require movement. And here's the truth. God does not bless hesitation. He blesses faith. Faith is not just believing for something. It is moving towards something. Think about Joshua and the Israelites standing at the Jordan River. They were ready to cross into the Promised Land. But there was a problem. The river was still there. It had not yet parted. And God told them something unusual. Step into the water first. Not after he performed the miracle, but before. And as soon as their feet touched the water, the river parted. Joshua 3:15-16. What does this teach us? Some prayers are not answered until you step forward in faith. Some of you are standing on the edge of what God has promised, waiting for him to part the waters. But he is waiting for you to step in first. So let me ask you, are you waiting for a breakthrough, or is your breakthrough waiting for you? Could it be that the delay in your life is not because God isn't answering, but because you haven't yet stepped out in faith? Could it be that the silence is not a rejection, but an invitation? Some of the greatest answers to prayer come not in moments of waiting, but in moments of walking. And here's something else you need to understand. God will not answer a prayer that contradicts his will. Too many people pray for things that were never meant for them. They pray for relationships that are toxic, for opportunities that will pull them away from him, for success that will destroy them spiritually. And when God doesn't grant those prayers, they think he is being silent, when in reality he is being merciful. Think about Jonah. He ran from God's calling, boarded a ship going the opposite direction, and ended up in the belly of a great fish. He must have prayed in that darkness, wondering why things had gone so wrong. But the truth was, Jonah had been praying for his own plan instead of submitting to God's, and God in his mercy redirected him. How many of us have been like Jonah, running in the wrong direction, praying for our own will instead of God's? If God is not answering a certain prayer, ask yourself, is this aligned with his purpose for my life? Because he will not bless something that will take you away from him. He loves you too much for that. So I challenge you, if you're in a season of waiting, if you feel like your prayers are unanswered, ask yourself, 1. Have I truly listened for God's whisper, or have I been expecting a dramatic sign? 2. Have I taken a step of faith, or am I waiting for God to move before I move? 3. Is what I'm praying for aligned with his will, or am I asking for something that serves my own desires more than his plan? If this message is speaking to you, declare it in the comments. I will step out in faith. I trust God's plan. Because God is not absent, he is not ignoring you. He is moving, preparing, aligning things beyond what you can see. And if you remain faithful, if you refuse to give up, you will step into something greater than you ever imagined. Stay with me, because in the next part of this message, I am going to reveal the final key that may unlock everything you've been waiting for. There is something about unanswered prayers that many people never realize. Sometimes what feels like God's silence is actually his way of drawing you closer. When everything is going well, when life is comfortable, it's easy to pray out of routine rather than desperation. But when the storm comes, when the answer doesn't arrive, when the silence stretches longer than you thought you could endure, that is when prayer becomes raw, real, and relentless. That is when you stop reciting words and start crying out from the depths of your soul. Look at Hannah. She prayed for years, begging God for a child, yet heaven remained silent. But something shifted in her prayers. One day, in the bitterness of her soul, she wept before the Lord, pouring out everything inside her. This wasn't just a request, it was surrender. And in that moment, something changed. Her circumstances didn't immediately shift, but her heart did. She left the temple with peace, and not long after she conceived Samuel, the prophet who would anoint kings. What if God's delay was meant to deepen your dependence on Him? What if the silence was meant to refine your faith, to strip away every distraction until all that remains is pure trust? Faith that is never tested is faith that is never truly known. It is easy to believe when everything is going right, but when heaven is silent, that is when your faith is truly revealed. Do you still trust when the answer doesn't come? Do you still worship when the miracle hasn't arrived? The greatest heroes of faith were not those who received immediate answers, but those who waited in the dark, believing that God was still moving, even when they couldn't see it. Abraham waited 25 years for Isaac. Joseph endured 13 years of betrayal and imprisonment before stepping into his calling. The Israelites wandered for 40 years before entering the Promised Land. And Jesus, after 3 days in the tomb, walked out in victory. If God is making you wait, you are in good company. Many people think prayer is about convincing God to move as if He needs persuasion. But prayer is not about changing God's mind. It is about changing you. It aligns your heart with His will, your desires with His purpose. Some prayers go unanswered because you are asking for something too small, something beneath what God has planned for you. What you see as the greatest desire of your heart, He sees as something that could limit you from stepping into your true calling. There was a man who prayed for a promotion at work, but he kept getting passed over. He felt frustrated, wondering why God wasn't opening the door. Then one day, his company shut down completely. At first, it felt like a disaster, but it was only then that he had the courage to start his own business, one that flourished far beyond anything he could have achieved in his old job. What he thought was a denial was actually divine redirection. He had been praying for a higher position, but God was preparing him to own the entire company. God sees what you cannot see. He knows what is ahead. The relationship you begged Him to restore might have led to heartbreak. The opportunity you cried out for might have stolen your peace. The path you were desperate to take might have ended in destruction. What if the very thing you are calling an unanswered prayer is actually His greatest act of mercy? Look at Paul. He had a thorn in the flesh, something that tormented him, something that made his life difficult. 3 times he pleaded with God to take it away, but God said no. Instead, He told Paul, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." That unanswered prayer became Paul's greatest source of strength. He learned that God's power was not just revealed in victories, but in struggles, in the moments when he had to rely on grace alone. What if your greatest testimony will not come from the prayers that were answered instantly, but from the ones that forced you to grow, to trust, to keep walking, even when you couldn't see the way ahead? Some prayers are answered in ways we don't expect. Some are answered through a process rather than a single moment. Some are answered by changing the situation, while others are answered by changing you. There is a reason you are hearing this right now. God knows exactly what you have been struggling with. He knows the prayers you have prayed, the nights you have cried, the doubts that have crept into your heart. And He is reminding you today that He is not done. The silence is not forever. The waiting is not wasted. Every second, every tear, every moment of confusion is shaping something inside of you that will be necessary for where He is taking you next. So do not stop praying. Do not stop believing. Do not let the enemy convince you that silence means absence. When you feel like giving up, press in even harder. The breakthrough may not come when you expect it, but when it does, it will be greater than anything you could have imagined. The answer may not look like what you pictured, but it will be exactly what you needed. And when that day comes, when you look back and see how every moment of waiting was leading you to something greater, you will thank God that He didn't answer your prayers the way you once begged Him to. If this word is speaking to your heart, declare it right now. God, I trust You even when I don't understand. Speak it, write it, let it take root in your soul. Because faith is not about seeing, it is about trusting that the one who started the work in you will be faithful to complete it. And he will. The silence will not last forever. The answer is coming. Keep believing. Keep standing. Keep praying. Because the God who seems silent is the God who has been working all along. Stay with me, because what comes next will take this revelation even deeper. There is still one more truth that many people never realize about unanswered prayers, and it could be the very key that shifts everything in your life. Some prayers remain unanswered, not because God is unwilling, but because there is a spiritual battle happening in the unseen. What many believers fail to realize is that some of the delays in their lives are not due to God's silence, but due to opposition from forces they cannot see. There are breakthroughs that heaven has already released, but they are being fought against in the spiritual realm. Look at Daniel. He was a man of prayer, a man of deep devotion to God. One day he prayed for understanding and sought God with all his heart, but nothing happened. A day passed, then another, then a week, still nothing. For 21 days Daniel waited, likely wondering why God had not answered. But what he did not know was that his answer had already been sent the moment he prayed. The delay was not because God was ignoring him, it was because a spiritual battle was taking place. When an angel finally appeared to him, he said something incredible. From the first day that you set your heart to understand and to humble yourself before your God, your words were heard, and I have come in response to them. But the prince of the kingdom of Persia resisted me for 21 days. Daniel 10, 12, 13. Did you catch that? From the first day. The very moment Daniel prayed, his request was heard, and the answer was on its way. But in the unseen world, a demonic force tried to block the angel from delivering the response. There was warfare over his prayer. How many times have you prayed, thinking God wasn't listening, when in reality the battle was raging over the very thing you were seeking? How many times have you given up too soon, walked away in frustration, not realizing that your breakthrough was just beyond the resistance? The enemy does not attack what does not threaten him. If your prayers had no power, if your breakthrough didn't matter, the enemy wouldn't fight so hard to delay it. The fact that you are facing opposition, the fact that you feel resistance, is evidence that something powerful is on its way. There are doors that have already been opened in the spiritual realm, but the enemy is standing in the way, trying to keep you from walking through them. There are blessings with your name on them, but the forces of darkness are trying to delay them long enough to make you give up before they arrive. What if Daniel had stopped praying on the 20th day? What if he had said, "God isn't answering me," and walked away? He never would have received his answer. He would have missed it. Not because God didn't send it, but because he stopped, pressing in before the breakthrough arrived. This is why persistence in prayer matters. This is why Jesus said, "Ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and the door will be opened." Matthew 7:7. Some doors do not open because you knocked once. Some answers do not come because you prayed one time and walked away. Some victories only come through consistent, relentless, unshakable prayer. The enemy is hoping you will get discouraged. He wants you to believe the lie that God isn't listening. He wants you to quit just before the breakthrough comes. But those who keep praying, those who refuse to stop believing, those are the ones who see the fulfillment of God's promises. Look at the parable of the persistent widow in Luke 18. Jesus told a story of a woman who kept going to a judge asking for justice. The judge did not want to listen to her, but because she refused to give up, because she kept coming, he eventually gave her what she requested. Jesus used this parable to teach one simple but powerful truth. Persistence moves things. If an unjust judge can be moved by persistence, how much more will your loving Father respond to those who refuse to stop believing? You must understand something. There are certain breakthroughs that only come through prayer and fasting. Jesus made this clear when his disciples tried to cast out a demon but failed. When they asked why, Jesus told them, "This kind does not go out except by prayer and fasting." Matthew 17:21. This means there are some things in your life that will not shift until you engage in spiritual warfare. Some chains will not break, some doors will not open, some answers will not come until you combine your prayers with fasting, pressing in until the resistance is shattered. If you are in a season where you feel like your prayers are not being answered, consider this. What if your answer has already been released, but there is a battle over it? What if your persistence is the very thing that will tip the scales, that will push through the resistance and bring the breakthrough into reality? The enemy's greatest weapon is deception. He wants to convince you that your prayers don't matter, that nothing is happening. But the truth is, your prayers shake the heavens. Your prayers send angels into battle. Your prayers release power that the enemy fears. So do not stop. Do not let frustration silence you. Do not let delay make you walk away. The battle is real, but so is the victory. And for those who refuse to give up, for those who continue pressing in, for those who stand firm even when they don't see movement, the reward is coming. The answer is coming. The breakthrough is on its way. If this word is speaking to your spirit, declare it now. I will not stop praying. I will press in until my breakthrough comes. Say it, believe it. Let it take root in your heart, because heaven has heard you. The moment you prayed, the answer was set in motion. And if you stand firm, if you refuse to let go, you will see the fulfillment of what God has already spoken over your life. Stay with me, because what I am about to share next might be the final piece that unlocks everything you've been waiting for. There is one more truth about unanswered prayers that many people never realize, and it might be the very thing holding back your breakthrough. Some prayers go unanswered not because of God's timing, not because of spiritual warfare, but because there is something in you that needs to be dealt with first. Have you ever considered that the delay might not be external, but internal? How often do we approach God asking for blessings while at the same time refusing to deal with the things He has already asked us to surrender? We cry out for open doors but refuse to close the ones that are tied to our past. We ask for peace but continue to hold on to resentment. We want provision but refuse to trust Him with what we already have. And then we wonder, why isn't God answering me? Look at what Jesus said in Mark 11:25. And when you stand praying, if you hold anything against anyone, forgive them, so that your Father in heaven may forgive you your sins. Do you see it? Unforgiveness blocks your prayers. You can fast, you can cry out, you can spend hours on your knees. But if you are holding resentment, bitterness, or anger in your heart, something is standing in the way. Think about it. How can we ask God for mercy if we refuse to extend mercy? How can we ask Him for blessings if we are still clinging to wounds from the past? Imagine a person who wants to climb a mountain but refuses to put down the heavy baggage they are carrying. They keep pushing forward, but every step is harder, every movement is slower, and eventually the weight becomes too much to bear. No matter how much strength they have, they will not reach the top unless they let go of what is holding them down. Some of us are carrying emotional and spiritual baggage that is delaying what God wants to do in our lives. We ask for more, but we haven't been faithful with what we already have. We seek breakthroughs, but refuse to break free from patterns that are keeping us in cycles. And until we surrender, until we release, we will remain in the waiting. Look at the Israelites. God had promised them a land flowing with milk and honey, but before they could enter, they had to go through the wilderness. What should have been an 11-day journey took 40 years. Why? Because they carried Egypt in their hearts. They carried complaining, rebellion, and a lack of trust in God. And until those things were removed, they could not step into the promise. How many of us are still walking in circles, wondering why the door hasn't opened? Could it be that God is waiting for you to let go of what is holding you back? What if the delay is not because God hasn't answered, but because He is waiting for you to be ready? Think about David. He was anointed king as a young man, yet he didn't step into the throne immediately. Instead, he went through years of hardship, running from Saul, hiding in caves, facing betrayal. It would have been easy for him to become bitter, to allow his heart to harden. But instead, David allowed the process to refine him. He didn't just pray for the promise, he prepared for it. And when the time was right, he stepped into his destiny fully equipped to handle the weight of what God had called him to. Many people want to receive the blessing, but few are willing to be prepared for the blessing. God does not just pour out His greatest gifts into hearts that are not ready to receive them. He is not just interested in giving you what you ask, for He is interested in transforming you in the process. This is why David prayed in Psalm 139, "Search me, God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting." That is the kind of prayer that changes everything. God, search me. Show me what needs to change. If there is bitterness, take it out. If there is pride, break it down. If there is anything in me that is blocking what you have for me, remove it. Because sometimes the greatest breakthrough is not what happens around you, but what happens inside you. And when your heart is aligned with God, when you let go of what is holding you back, when you surrender everything, that is when the doors fly open. That is when the prayers that once seemed unanswered suddenly make sense. So take a moment, right now, ask yourself, is there something in my heart that is blocking my prayer? Is there something I need to release before I can receive what God has for me? Think about a farmer planting seeds. If the soil is filled with rocks and thorns, the seeds will never take root. The farmer can water them, care for them, wait for the rain, but nothing will grow until the ground is prepared. Some of us are asking for a harvest while refusing to let God prepare the soil of our hearts. We want to see the fruit, but we are unwilling to go through the process of uprooting the things that are preventing growth. God's silence is not always a denial. It is often an invitation to go deeper. It is a moment to pause and ask, "Lord, what do you need to change in me before you release what I'm asking for?" Because when you let go, when you forgive, when you surrender fully, that is when you will see the power of God move like never before. If this word is speaking to you, I want you to declare it right now. God, I surrender everything. I trust your timing. I trust your plan. Say it, believe it. Let it be a moment of breakthrough in your life, because your answer is not denied. It's preparing you for something greater than you can imagine. Stay with me, because we are about to bring everything together in the final moments of this message. What I share next might be the most important thing you hear today. There is a moment in every believer's life when God's silence becomes unbearable. The longer the wait, the heavier the doubt, and at some point an unshakable question rises in the heart. Has God forgotten me? You pray, you cry, you plead when heaven seems quiet. The silence lingers, stretching further than you ever thought you could endure. And in that silence, something dangerous begins to take root. Doubt. Doubt is subtle. It starts as a whisper. Maybe I didn't pray enough. Maybe I didn't have enough faith. Maybe God is punishing me. But if you don't fight it, if you let it stay, it grows into something deeper. Maybe God doesn't love me like He loves others. Maybe He never intended to answer me at all. And that is exactly what the enemy wants. The enemy knows that he cannot stop God's promises from being fulfilled. He cannot block what God has already spoken over your life. But what he can do is convince you to give up before the promise arrives. And the moment you let go, the moment you allow doubt to take over, you step away from what was already set in motion for you. But have you ever considered that silence is a test? Think about a teacher in a classroom. When the time comes for a test, what does the teacher do? They become silent. They step back. They watch. Not because they don't care, not because they have abandoned their students, but because they are seeing what the student has learned. Some of the greatest moments of silence from God are not signs of His absence. They are moments where He is watching to see if you will trust what He already told you. Go back to Abraham. God had already spoken a promise over him, descendants as numerous as the stars. And yet for years Abraham heard nothing, no confirmation, no signs, just silence. But here's the question. Did the silence mean the promise was no longer valid? Did the silence mean that God had changed His mind? Absolutely not. The silence was a test. Would Abraham hold on to what God already said? Or would he let doubt steal his faith? The same is true for you. God does not speak just to entertain you. When He gives a promise, when He speaks a word over your life, He expects you to hold on to it, even when the silence comes. Faith is not proven in the moments when God is speaking loud and clear. Faith is proven in the moments when heaven is quiet, when everything around you tells you to give up, when every circumstance says it's never going to happen. Will you still believe? Think about Jesus in the wilderness. Before He began His ministry, He was led by the Spirit into the desert, where He fasted for 40 days. And in that silence, the enemy came. If you are the Son of God, turn these stones into bread. Do you realize what Satan was doing? He was trying to make Jesus question what God had already said. Just 40 days earlier, at Jesus' baptism, the heavens opened, and God declared, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." But now in the wilderness there was no voice from heaven, no divine reassurance, no open skies, just silence and temptation. The enemy will always attack after a word from God has been spoken over you. He knows that if he can get you to question what God has already said, he can make you surrender before the promise is fulfilled. So let me ask you, are you allowing silence to make you doubt what God already told you? Are you letting the delay convince you that His promise is no longer valid? Because the truth is, what God spoke over your life has not changed. The silence is not a sign that He has forgotten. It is a sign that He is watching to see if you will believe, even when you cannot hear Him. Think about Job. He lost everything. His wealth, his family, his health, everything was stripped away. And in that moment of pain, he prayed, he cried out, but heaven was silent. But even in his suffering, even in the deafening silence, Job refused to let go of his faith. He declared, "Though He slay me, yet will I trust in Him." Job 13:15. And because of that unwavering faith, Job's story did not end in suffering. The silence was temporary, and when it lifted, God restored everything he had lost double. Could it be that your moment of silence is not the end of your story, but the test before your breakthrough? Could it be that right now, in this season of waiting, heaven is watching to see if you will hold on to the promise? Because here's what you must understand. God already spoke what He needed to speak over your life. The promise has already been declared. The plan has already been set. But now He is watching. Will you still trust Him when you hear nothing? Will you still walk in faith when the silence stretches longer than you expected? Because those who hold on, those who refuse to let doubt steal what God has already said, those are the ones who see the fulfillment of the promise. So if you are in a season of silence right now, if you feel like your prayers are being met with nothing but quiet, stand firm, keep believing, hold on to what He already said. Because the silence is not forever. The test will pass. And when it does, the breakthrough will be greater than anything you could have imagined. Declare it right now. I trust God even in the silence. Say it. Believe it. Let it be your declaration in this season, because the silence is not the end. It is the test before the miracle. And what's coming next will be worth every moment of waiting. Some people think unanswered prayers are a sign that God doesn't care, But what if the silence is actually his greatest act of love? Think about this. A good father does not give his child everything they ask for. Not because he doesn't love them, but because he knows better. If a child asks to play with fire, the father says no, not out of cruelty, but out of protection. If a child wants to eat candy for every meal, the father refuses, not to withhold joy, but to preserve health. If a teenager demands the keys to a car before they know how to drive, the father does not grant the request, not to limit their freedom, but to save their life. God is a good father, and sometimes his silence is not a denial, it is protection. How many times have we prayed for things we thought we needed, only to look back years later and thank God that he didn't give them to us? That relationship you begged him to restore, it would have destroyed you. That job you desperately wanted, it would have taken you away from your purpose. That opportunity you thought was perfect, it would have led to heartache. What if what feels like rejection is actually redirection? Look at Paul. He was a man of deep faith, a man who performed miracles, a man who saw God move in extraordinary ways. And yet even Paul had prayers that went unanswered. In 2 Corinthians 12, Paul speaks of a thorn in the flesh, something that tormented him. He prayed 3 times, 3 desperate prayers, asking God to remove it. But instead of giving Paul what he asked for, God gave him something greater. He said, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." Paul didn't get what he wanted, but he got what he needed, a deeper revelation of God's grace. How many times have we asked God to take away the very thing he is using to strengthen us? We ask for the storm to end, but God knows that the storm is what will deepen our faith. We ask for the trial to pass, but God knows that the trial is what will prepare us for the next season. We ask for immediate relief, but God is working on eternal transformation. God's silence is often his way of working at a level we cannot yet comprehend. Think about Joseph. He was given dreams of greatness, but what happened next? Betrayal, slavery, prison, years of silence. Imagine how many nights he lay awake in that prison cell, wondering if he had misunderstood God's promise. Imagine how many times he cried out asking, "Why, God? Why haven't you rescued me?" But what Joseph didn't know was that his suffering was the setup for something greater. If he had never been betrayed, he would have never been sold into slavery. If he had never been sold into slavery, he would have never ended up in Egypt. If he had never been in Egypt, he would have never been positioned in Pharaoh's palace. And when the famine came, when his brothers, who had once betrayed him, stood before him in need, Joseph finally understood. What they meant for evil, God had meant for good. Some of you are in a prison season right now. You feel abandoned, forgotten, silenced. But what if the very thing that seems like a curse is actually the path to your calling? What if the pain is shaping you? What if the waiting is refining you? What if the silence is where your faith is being strengthened? Because here's the truth. The waiting season is never wasted. God does not operate on our timeline. He sees the full picture, while we only see a single frame. We pray for a door to open, but God is building an entirely new house. We ask for a small blessing, but God is preparing something beyond our imagination. We want an answer, but God wants transformation. And the greatest move of God in your life may not be what he gives you, but what he teaches you in the silence. Think about Noah. God told him to build an ark, but then nothing. No rain, no flood. Just years of waiting, years of mockery, years of wondering, did I really hear from God? But what would have happened if Noah had given up? What if after the first 5 years he stopped building? What if after 10 years he walked away? The rain would have come, and he would not have been ready. Some of you are being called to build in the silence, to prepare for what you cannot see yet, to keep believing, keep praying, keep standing on God's word, even when nothing seems to be happening. Because when the rain comes on, when the breakthrough arrives, and when the promise is fulfilled, you do not want to be the person who gave up too soon. So let me ask you, are you willing to trust God even when you don't understand? Are you willing to believe in His plan even when the answer doesn't come right away? Are you willing to hold on to His promises even when the silence feels unbearable? Because the truth is, He has not forgotten you. Your prayer has not been ignored. Your waiting is not in vain. The silence is not a punishment, it is preparation. And if you refuse to give up, if you choose to trust, if you continue to stand, firm knee, you will see what God has been working on all along. Declare it right now. God, I trust you even in the waiting. Say it. Believe it. Let it take root in your heart. Because the silence is not the end of your story. It is the setup for something far greater than you can imagine. Stay with me, because what I'm about to share next may be the final key that unlocks everything you've been waiting for. Some prayers remain unanswered, not because God is distant, not because He is indifferent, but because He is doing something inside you before He does something for you. We live in a world that demands instant results. Everything is fast. Fast food, fast internet, fast success. And if something takes too long, we assume something is wrong. But God does not operate on human deadlines. He is not interested in quick fixes. He is interested in lasting transformation. Many people want a breakthrough, but they don't want to go through the process that builds the character necessary to sustain it. Think about this. If a tree grows too fast, if it shoots up without deep roots, the moment a storm comes, it falls. But when a tree grows slowly, when its roots dig deep, when its foundation is strong and it can withstand any storm. Some of you are asking for something that requires deep roots. You are praying for influence, but God is building your humility. First, you are asking for a platform, but God is refining your heart first. You are crying out for promotion, but God is developing the discipline to sustain it first. Because what good is a blessing that destroys you? Look at King Saul and King David. Saul was chosen quickly. The people demanded a king, and God allowed it. But Saul's character could not sustain his position. He was impulsive, prideful, disobedient, and in the end, he lost everything. Now look at David, anointed as king years before he actually stepped into the throne. God could have placed him in power immediately, but instead David had to go through seasons of waiting, seasons of testing, seasons of being molded by God. And when the time came, when the process was complete, when his heart had been shaped by fire, David stepped into his destiny, not as an impulsive leader, but as a man after God's own heart. Which one do you want to be? Do you want the quick answer, or do you want the right answer? Because God is not just answering your prayer, He is preparing you for it. Look at Joseph. He had a dream of greatness, a vision of ruling, a destiny that seemed clear and immediate. But before the crown came the pit, before the throne came the prison, before the promise came the process. If God had placed Joseph in leadership the moment he received the dream, he would not have been ready. He needed the years of testing, the betrayal, the false accusations, the waiting, not to destroy him, but to develop him. Some of you are in your prison season right now. Some of you are in your waiting season right now, and you are asking, God, why haven't you answered me? But what if He is answering you right now, just not in the way you expected? What if this season of waiting is not a delay, but a preparation? Look at an athlete training for the Olympics. They don't wake up one day and suddenly compete on the world stage. They train for years. They push their bodies through suffering, through exhaustion, through resistance. Every muscle is tested, every weakness is confronted. Because when the moment of competition comes, they need to be ready. What if the thing you're praying for requires a version of you that you have not yet become? What if the thing you are asking God for is so big, so life-changing, so powerful, that He is spending extra time preparing you, because he doesn't want you to just receive it, he wants you to be able to keep it. Some doors remain closed because the weight of the blessing behind them requires stronger shoulders to carry it. You have been asking God to open doors, but maybe he is asking, are you ready to walk through them? You have been asking for more, but maybe he is saying, can you be faithful with what you have now? Because if you are not faithful in the waiting, you will not be faithful in the breakthrough. Look at the parable of the talents. A master gave 3 servants different amounts of money to manage. 2 invested what they were given, and when the master returned, he increased their responsibility. But 1 servant buried his talent. He did nothing with it. And when the master returned, he lost even what little he had. God is watching what you do in the waiting. Are you preparing? Or are you complaining? Are you growing? Or are you grumbling? Are you trusting? Or are you doubting? Because those who are faithful in the waiting are the ones who are trusted with greater things. So let me ask you, if the answer to your prayer required you to wait 5 more years, would you still be faithful? If the door you're knocking on didn't open until 10 years from now, would you still trust him? If the promise you're holding on to doesn't happen until long after you expected, would you still believe? Because this is where real faith is tested. Faith is not proven in the moments when God answers immediately. Faith is not measured by how quickly a breakthrough comes. Faith is revealed when you hold on to God, even when nothing makes sense. And here's what you must understand. The waiting season is not punishment. It is preparation. If you are still waiting, it means God is still working. If the door hasn't opened, it means something is still being built. If the answer hasn't come, it means the miracle is still in motion. Because here is the truth. God does not start something. He does not intend to finish. Philippians 1:6 says, "He who began a good work in you will be faithful to complete it." So if he started it, he will finish it. If he promised it, he will fulfill it. If he spoke it, it will come to pass. Your job is not to figure out the timing. Your job is to be faithful. Because the ones who receive the promise are the ones who refuse to let go of it. Declare it now. God, I will trust you in the waiting. Say it. Believe it. Let it be the foundation of your faith. Because what's coming is greater than what you're leaving behind. Stay with me, because what I'm about to share next might be the very thing that shifts your entire perspective on unanswered prayers. Some prayers feel unanswered, not because God has not heard them, but because He is working in a way that you cannot yet see. We assume that when God moves, we will feel it, that when He answers, it will be obvious, that when the breakthrough comes, it will be immediate. But what if God is answering your prayer right now, just not in the way you expected? Think about a seed planted in the ground. When a farmer buries a seed, he does not panic the next day when he doesn't see results. He does not dig up the soil in frustration, assuming nothing is happening. He knows that even though he cannot see it, the seed is breaking open beneath the surface, roots are forming, life is beginning to grow. Some of you are frustrated because you do not see movement in your situation. But just because you don't, see, it doesn't mean God isn't doing it. Some prayers are germinating in the soil of your faith. If you stop praying now, if you give up now, you are walking away from something that is already in progress. Look at Elijah. He prayed for rain after a long drought. He sent his servant to look at the sky, nothing. He prayed again, still nothing. He prayed a third time, nothing changed. 6 times he sent his servant to check the horizon, and 6 times the sky was empty. But Elijah refused to stop praying. On the 7th time, his servant came back and said, "I see a cloud the size of a man's hand, just a tiny cloud." Nothing impressive, nothing miraculous yet. But Elijah knew. That small cloud was the beginning of the storm he had been praying for. Some of you are waiting for a downpour, but God has already sent a cloud the size of a man's hand. A small opportunity, a small breakthrough, a small change in the situation, but instead of recognizing it as the beginning, you're dismissing it as insignificant. Could it be that the answer is already forming, but you haven't recognized it yet? God's timing is not our timing. He is never late, but He is also never rushed. And here's what you must understand. Delayed answers often produce the greatest miracles. Look at Lazarus. Mary and Martha sent word to Jesus saying, "Lord, the one you love is sick." They expected Him to come immediately. They had seen Him heal others. They knew He had the power. But instead of rushing to their side, Jesus waited. And in that waiting, Lazarus died. Can you imagine what they must have felt? They had faith that Jesus could heal their brother. But now it was too late. The miracle window had closed, or so they thought. By the time Jesus arrived, Lazarus had been in the tomb for 4 days. And Martha said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." She believed He could have healed Lazarus, but she did not yet understand that He could resurrect him. Some of you are crying out, "Lord, if you had answered me sooner, things wouldn't have fallen apart." But what if God is not trying to fix what was lost? What if He is planning to resurrect something even greater? Jesus looked at them and said, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" And then He called Lazarus out of the tomb, alive, restored, transformed. What Mary and Martha thought was the end of the story was actually the setup for a greater miracle. Some of you are mourning what you think is dead, the dream that didn't happen, the opportunity that slipped away, the answer that never came. But what if God allowed it to die so that when He brings it back, it will be undeniable that His hand was upon it? Because when God answers in His time, it is greater than anything we could have imagined. You thought He was late. You thought He forgot. You thought it was over. But He is standing in front of the situation you buried, and He is saying, "Come forth," because what you thought was gone is not gone. God was just preparing to bring it back in a way that no one could deny. So here is the real question. Can you trust God's timing? Can you trust Him when the answer takes longer than you expected? Can you trust Him when the door doesn't open immediately? Can you trust Him when your prayers seem to be hitting a wall? Because those who trust, those who wait, those who refuse to walk away, those are the ones who see the power of God in ways that others never will. So let me ask you one final time, will you hold on? Will you keep praying? Will you keep believing, even when nothing makes sense? Because the waiting is never wasted. The delay is never denial. The silence is never absence. God is working right now in ways you cannot see. So if you receive this word today, declare it in faith. God, I trust your timing. Say it, believe it. Let it be the foundation of your faith, because the story is not over. And when God moves, it will be greater than you ever imagined. Stay with me, because now we are entering the final part of this journey. The conclusion of this message will bring everything together, and it might be the confirmation your heart has been waiting for. Now we have arrived at the final moment of this journey. You have walked through the questions, the struggles, the waiting, and the silence. But now it is time to bring everything together. Listen to me carefully. God has never ignored you, not once, not for a moment. From the first tear you cried, from the first desperate prayer, from the first time you whispered, "God, do you even hear me?" He heard you. And not only did He hear you, He responded. Maybe not in the way you expected, maybe not in the timing you wanted, but He was never absent. Think about everything we have walked through together in this message. The silence of God is not rejection, it is preparation. The delay is not a denial, it is divine alignment. The waiting is not wasted, it is where your faith is being strengthened, and now you have a choice. You can leave this message and go back to questioning, back to doubting, back to wondering if God is still listening. Or you can walk forward in unshakable faith. Faith that refuses to be broken by silence. Faith that stands even when prayers take years to be answered. Faith that declares, I trust you, Lord, even when I don't understand. Because here's the truth. Some of you are so close to your breakthrough, but the only thing standing between you and the promise is your ability to keep believing. God does not test you to break you, He tests you to prepare you. And right now, in this very moment, He is watching. Will you hold on? Will you trust Him without a deadline? Because those who wait on the Lord, those who refuse to quit, those who keep pressing, keep believing, keep standing firm, they are the ones who will see His power in ways that others never will. So make your decision now. If you choose to trust, if you choose to believe, if you refuse to walk away before the miracle happens, then declare it right now in the comments, I will wait on the Lord. I trust His timing. Say it, write it. Let it be a marker in your life. Because today something shifts. And as we close this message, if this word has spoken to your heart, if you have felt the Holy Spirit move through this message, then take one more step of faith. Like this video. Share it with someone who needs to hear this. Make sure you are subscribed to this channel, because messages like this are meant to keep you strong in your faith. And finally, before you leave, take a moment. Sit in the presence of God. And Martha said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. She believed He could have healed Lazarus, but she did not yet understand that He could resurrect him. Some of you are crying out, Lord, if you had answered me sooner, things wouldn't have fallen apart. But what if God is not trying to fix what was lost? What if He is planning to resurrect something even greater? Jesus looked at them and said, Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? And then He called Lazarus out of the tomb, alive, restored, transformed. What Mary and Martha thought was the end of the story was actually the setup for a greater miracle. Some of you are mourning what you think is dead, the dream that didn't happen, the opportunity that slipped away, the answer that never came. But what if God allowed it to die so that when He brings it back, it will be undeniable that His hand was upon it? Because when God answers in His time, it is greater than anything we could have imagined. You thought He was late, you thought He forgot, you thought it was over, but He is standing in front of the situation you buried, and He is saying, Come forth, because what you thought was gone is not gone. God was just preparing to bring it back in a way that no one could deny. So here is the real question. Can you trust God's timing? Can you trust Him when the answer takes longer than you expected? Can you trust Him when the door doesn't open immediately? Can you trust Him when your prayers seem to be hitting a wall? Because those who trust, those who wait, those who refuse to walk away, those are the ones who see the power of God in ways that others never will. So let me ask you one final time, will you hold on? Will you keep praying? Will you keep believing, even when nothing makes sense? Because the waiting is never wasted. The delay is never denial. The silence is never absence. God is working right now in ways you cannot see. So if you receive this word today, declare it in faith. God, I trust your timing. Say it, believe it. Let it be the foundation of your faith, because the story is not over. And when God moves, it will be greater than you ever imagined. Stay with me, because now we are entering the final part of this journey. The conclusion of this message will bring everything together, and it might be the confirmation your heart has been waiting for. Now we have arrived at the final moment of this journey. You have walked through the questions, the struggles, the waiting, and the silence. But now it is time to bring everything together. Listen to me carefully. God has never ignored you, not once, not for a moment. From the first tear you cried, from the first desperate prayer, from the first time you whispered, "God, do you even hear me?" He heard you. And not only did he hear you, he responded. Maybe not in the way you expected. Maybe not in the timing you wanted, but he was never absent. Think about everything we have walked through together in this message. The silence of God is not rejection, it is preparation. The delay is not a denial, it is divine alignment. The waiting is not wasted, it is where your faith is being strengthened, and now you have a choice. You can leave this message and go back to questioning, back to doubting, back to wondering if God is still listening. Or you can walk forward in unshakable faith. Faith that refuses to be broken by silence. Faith that stands even when prayers take years to be answered. Faith that declares, "I trust you, Lord, even when I don't understand." Because here's the truth. Some of you are so close to your breakthrough, but the only thing standing between you and the promise is your ability to keep believing. God does not test you to break you, He tests you to prepare you. And right now, in this very moment, He is watching. Will you hold on? Will you trust Him without a deadline? Because those who wait on the Lord, those who refuse to quit, those who keep pressing, keep believing, keep standing firm, they are the ones who will see His power in ways that others never will. So make your decision now. If you choose to trust, if you choose to believe, if you refuse to walk away before the miracle happens, then declare it right now in the comments, "I will wait on the Lord. I trust His timing." Say it, write it. Let it be a marker in your life. Because today something shifts. And as we close this message, if this word has spoken to your heart, if you have felt the Holy Spirit move through this message, then take one more step of faith. Like this video. Share it with someone who needs to hear this. Make sure you are subscribed to this channel, because messages like this are meant to keep you strong in your faith. And finally, before you leave, take a moment. Sit in the presence of God.